Good morning. You can be opening your Bibles to 2 Kings chapter 4. And as you're turning there, I just want to encourage all the men here specifically that in a couple weeks when Marty Broadwell comes for the Men's Day on Saturday, nobody teaches like Marty teaches. When I was in Atlanta, he was one of the guys at the church there that I spent perhaps more time with than anybody else. And it will be well worth your time to learn what he has to say about spiritual leadership, about letting the words of the Spirit be the things that guide every decision that you make. You will be richly blessed to be there that day when he's here to speak. We just sang a song about singing and being happy. And sometimes we struggle to see the rainbow. Sometimes the pleasures of earth frown and pass us by. And it seems like we don't always have the things in this life that we might want to have. We can sometimes feel like we're in the spiritual minority. Try to imagine living in a time in 2 Kings where God's people have divided into the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The bloodline of David is in the southern kingdom. In the northern kingdom, every single king that reigns there is absolutely wicked. And it's not just that you could look within your nation if you lived in the northern kingdom and see that there's so much idolatry and so much wickedness and so much abuse of power. But you've got international conflicts as well. You've got other nations like the Syrians who are treating you like a grocery store, except they don't pay for anything and they take everything by force. Imagine living in a time of a famine. Imagine living in days of death and darkness, and you can't look to your political leaders for any kind of spiritual guidance, and you can't look to a lot of your own people for any kind of encouragement, except for this little community called the Sons of the Prophets. We first read about the sons of the prophets in 1 Kings chapter 20. There's a little story that says a few things about these guys. But they're primarily found in 2 Kings during the time of Elisha the prophet that came after Elijah. Now, 1 and 2 Samuel will talk about things like the school of the prophets, perhaps similar in philosophy of what they all stood for and things like that. But the sons of the prophets, who were these guys? These guys were not literally, I think, the biological children of the prophets, but they were people who aligned themselves with those who had the boldness to speak truth in a corrupt society. You remember when Elijah was depressed and God told him, "You're not alone, Elijah. There's 7,000 other people that haven't bowed the knee to Baal." It's shortly after that story that we start reading about the sons of the prophets as 1 and 2 Kings continues. Once Elisha is firmly set in place as the new prophet after Elijah, I want to show you what happens with some of these stories that are maybe easy to neglect. But there's this cycle that happens in these stories with Elisha, where he has some interactions with the sons of the prophets, and then he's got the woman of Shunem, and then you go back to the sons of the prophets, and then you got Naaman the leper, and then you've got the sons of the prophets again. And you got the scripture references that you can see there on the PowerPoint. But notice that these stories shift between going from the sons of the prophets, who, by the way, were poor people. Because they didn't align themselves with the corrupt politicians of the day, perhaps that being one of the reasons, they did not get a lot of the earthly riches that other people may have experienced at this time. And so Elisha will spend time with these poor people and give them a miraculous provision of oil. And then he'll go and spend time with a wealthy woman, the woman of Shunem, and she'll have a miraculous conception, and then her child dies, perhaps some kind of heat stroke or something, and then he's resurrected. And then Elisha goes back to the sons of the prophets, and he gives them a miraculous provision of food. And then he spends time with the really rich, powerful Naaman, and he gives them this miraculous healing. And then you go back to the sons of the prophets back to these poor people. Now, the stories that are in the black type here, these ones are the ones that are probably better known. The ones that are lesser known would be these smaller stories where Elisha is spending time with these poor people that have aligned themselves not with the corruption of the world, but with the Lord. And these are 3 stories of God taking care of people that have aligned themselves with His purposes. And so what I want to do in this lesson is going to be very simple. We're just going to look at each one of these 3 stories that are in red here, just one after another, and just draw out some things that I think are valuable lessons for us today. So let's go ahead and start out with this first one, with this miraculous provision of oil, or oil, or Earl. Look at 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 1 through 7. Now the wife of one of the sons of the prophets cried to Elisha, "Your servant, my husband, is dead. And you know that your servant feared the Lord, but the creditor has come to take my 2 children to be his slaves." And Elisha said to her, "What shall I do for you? Tell me, what have you in your house?" And she said, "Your servant has nothing in the house except a jar of oil." Then he said, "Go outside, borrow vessels from all your neighbors, empty vessels, and not too few. Then go in and shut the door behind yourself and your sons, and pour into all these vessels, and when one is full, set it aside." So she went from him and shut the door behind herself and her sons, and as she poured, they brought the vessels to her. When the vessels were full, she said to her son, "Bring me another vessel." And he said to her, "There is not another." Then the oil stopped flowing. She came and told the man of God, and he said, "Go, sell the oil and pay your debts. You and your sons can live on the rest." Now in this story, this is not so much focused on the community of the sons of the prophets, but this is a woman who is married to one of the sons of the prophets. And I want you to try to imagine what's happening here. This woman, her husband has died. She's got 2 sons, and we'll see later on in this text that it was 2 sons and not like a boy and a girl. But verse 7 is going to say that it was 2 sons. And she goes to Elisha, begging and crying out to him by saying, "My husband is dead. He was one of the guys who aligned himself with you and the Lord. You know that he feared the Lord," in verse 1. And now he's left us with debt, and there's these creditors coming that are going to take my 2 sons. The 2 sons, by the way, that in this culture would have allowed her to continue to live. Can you imagine being in a situation like that? And Elisha looks at her, and he asks the question, "What do you have?" You know, it seems obvious that the answer would be, well, we don't have anything. And you're asking me what we have. We have 1 jar of oil, and in this time period, it would have likely been olive oil for burning candles and cooking things. And Elisha tells her to go to all of her neighbors, as many people as you can go to, and collect a bunch of empty jars. He tells them to then shut the door and to start pouring oil from the 1 jar, presumably, that you have into all of these empty vessels. That's the instruction she's given, which doesn't make any sense. But I love how verse 4 begins by saying, "So she went." It doesn't say, "So she argued," "So she disagreed," "So she thought about human philosophy and how it didn't make sense with what he was commanding." No, the text says, "So she went." Can you imagine her knocking on the doors of all of her neighbors, going, "We need some empty jars of oil"? Have you ever had a time before where you were cooking something and you didn't have a tomato, or maybe you didn't have onion, or something, and you went to your neighbor's house saying, "Hey, we need this specific thing to complete the ingredients that we need"? Have you ever had somebody come to you and say, "Hey, we need some empty mason jars. That's really what we need right now"? That's what they're doing. And these sons are collecting all of these jars. They shut the door, and imagine that 1 jar that she has, and I imagine her looking at it, and maybe she shakes her head and goes, "Okay, well, this is what the man of God said to do," and she pours 1 jar into an empty vessel, and then it gets filled up, and she sets it down. "Okay, bring me the next one." She looks in the jar maybe, and she sees that it's not empty. "Okay, we'll do it again." And then it just kind of becomes a normal thing for this moment, and she keeps pouring more and more and more in until she says, "All right, bring me another." And the son says, "There's no more. That's all of them." This woman goes over to Elisha. You can imagine her excitedly running over to him and saying, everything that you said works. And Elisha says, sell the oil and pay off your debts and then live on the rest. You've been given more than what you needed for this moment. You've been given enough to live on for the rest of your life. Can you imagine her going to the creditors? And maybe those creditors had kind of sized up her sons, going, man, these guys are going to make great slave labor. And she comes up with the bill. Here's all the money, you don't get my sons. What? How did that happen? What is it that we learn from this story if we were going to just draw a couple lessons from this? One of them would be that your wealth doesn't determine your righteousness. Clint wrote an article about those kinds of ideas in the bulletin this morning. But what would you think about a man who leaves a wife and 2 children with 1 jar of oil and debt? You might think about a man like that this was somebody who didn't fear the Lord. This was somebody who was a very unrighteous man. But verse 1 of this text says that he was somebody who feared the Lord. In the Bible, there are righteous wealthy people and there are righteous unwealthy people, or righteous poor people. That your physical circumstances don't determine or show you for sure that this means God's pleased with me or not. And this woman, and the difficult situation they're in, God provides for her. But maybe you're looking at your circumstances and going, well, I got a lot of money, and that must mean that God's really pleased with me. Or, I don't got a lot of money, and that must mean that the Lord's not pleased with me. And the Bible teaches again and again that we're not supposed to look at our circumstances and from that deduce that God is pleased or not with us. Maybe that's one thing that we could learn from this. I learned another lesson here on the necessity of obedience. This woman is told to do things that are just kind of strange. Borrow empty vessels from her neighbors. And then keep filling it up. Like, if you're just given that instruction, you might go, I don't understand, it doesn't compute how that's going to solve our problems, but if this is what the prophet of God has said to do, then we better do that. You know, how many things in our life would be solved if we would just simply do what God says? You guys want the peace that surpasses understanding? Oh yeah, that sounds really good. I want peace that surpasses understanding. Okay, how do I do that? In Philippians 4, verses 6 and 7, do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God, and the God of peace, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. How many of you like that idea of having your minds guarded and having this peace and not having this anxiety? You could go to all kinds of books written by men, and they would tell you all kinds of things to do. And then this passage says, if you do what this says, make your requests be made known to the Lord. How many of us want that kind of peace, but we just haven't done what this text says to do? What the instruction is the way that it helps us obtain it. Let me give you another example of this. If your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away, for it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body go into hell. Jesus, of course, being metaphorical here. How many of you keep tripping up with a certain sin that you keep giving yourself access to? You keep putting yourself in that position with that person when nobody else is around you. Or you keep getting yourself in that position in front of that computer when nobody else is around you. Or whatever, maybe it's a certain attitude that keeps tripping you up. And you keep putting yourself in the situation, but then after the situation's over, you complain that I wish that this wasn't a problem in my life. Do what Jesus said to do. Cut the access off. Obey what he says, and you'll find healing. You know, if this woman wouldn't have ever obeyed and would have said, well, this instruction doesn't make sense, or this instruction is too difficult, or this instruction just doesn't make sense to me, then I don't think she would have been blessed in this situation. Here's another lesson, though, from this. That God fills and uses empty vessels. Imagine hypothetically that this woman, as her sons are knocking on the doors of their neighbors, if they say, well, you know, we heard that your daddy died, how about, you know, instead of an empty vessel, we'd really like to help you with something more than that. Like, can we give you a bunch of potatoes or tomatoes or something like that? And they go, you know what? What we need right now are empty vessels. We come broken to be mended. We come empty to be filled, one of the hymns that we've been singing more lately. What kind of vessel does the Lord use? 2 Timothy 2:21 says, "Therefore, if anyone cleanses himself from what is dishonorable, he will be a vessel for honorable use, set apart as holy, useful to the master of the house, ready for every good work." Do you know what kind of vessel the Lord wants to fill? It's not the kind of vessel that comes to the Lord and says, you know what? I've learned lots of things from the ways of the world. I've really, cultivated this way that I like to think about things. God, I'd like to take these things that I've learned and employ it in your service. And God would say, no, you've got to empty yourself of things that are dishonorable. Come to me as an empty vessel if you want to be filled with the right things. And maybe those are some lessons that we could learn from the story of the miraculous oil. Let's go to the next story, though, and think about this miraculous food that is provided. Now, in 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 38 to 44, you get sort of two little stories that are squished together because they're very similar to one another, and they seem to be happening on a similar occasion. But look at 2 Kings chapter 4, starting in verse 38. "And Elisha came again to Gilgal." Now, before I keep reading, do you remember the significance of Gilgal in the Bible? Gilgal was the place where the Israelites first camped after they were done in the wilderness. They crossed the Jordan River, they came into Gilgal, and it seems like about the third day of being in the promised land that God stopped sending manna from heaven, and they started eating from the land of flowing with milk and honey in Gilgal. And now they're in Gilgal again, and there's something to do with food here. "And Elisha came again to Gilgal when there was a famine in the land, and as the sons of the prophets were sitting before him, he said to his servants, set on the large pot and boil stew for the sons of the prophets. And one of them went out into the field to gather herbs, and found a wild vine, and gathered from it his lap full of wild gourds, and came and cut them up and put them into the pot of stew, not knowing what they were. And they poured out some for the men to eat. But while they were eating of the stew, they cried out, 'O man of God, there is death in the pot,' and they could not eat it. He said, 'Then bring flour.' And he threw it into the pot and said, 'Pour some out for the men that they may eat.' And there was no harm in the pot. A man came from Baal Shalisha, bringing the man of God bread of the firstfruits, 20 loaves of barley and fresh ears of grain in his sack. And Elisha said, 'Give to the man that they may eat.' But his servant said, 'How can I set this before 100 men?' So he repeated, 'Give to the men that they may eat, for thus says the Lord, they shall eat and have some left.' So he set it before them, and they ate and had some left according to the word of the Lord." Try to imagine again what's happening here. Again, this is taking place during some kind of a famine. And this community of the sons of the prophets are all gathered together. And Elisha says, all right, it's time to get some sort of wild stew made. So get the big pot. They set the big pot. You can imagine like there's water added to it, and they got the fire going. And one of the sons of the prophets goes out. Can you imagine these people collecting all these things on the ground? And this guy finds this wild vine. You can imagine him looking at it going, not sure what that is, but we'll see. And he dices it all up and throws it all in there. Would you like that guy cooking for you, by the way? When they start eating, immediately somebody takes like a little taste of it and goes, "This tastes like death. There's death in that pot." All right, Elisha, you told us to make this. What are you going to do to take care of us right now? This is the typical way that you solve a problem like this, just get some flour, that just kind of erases all the death that's in the pot. They get some flour, and they put it in, and then can you imagine the first person taking a bite? Elisha says, "No, it's okay now." Well, we was about to die. And he says, "Well, with the flour's in, you imagine the faith of the first person that took the bite? And maybe it's around this same time that some guy bringing 20 loaves of barley from his first fruits. By the way, the first fruits would normally go to the priests. But they're in the northern kingdom, and there are no legitimate priests here. So I take it that this is a God-fearer in the northern kingdom that comes to these sons of the prophets and says, hey, Elisha, I want you to go ahead and take this bread. Like maybe keep it a secret that I gave it to you. I just really want to take care of you. And he says, give it to all these men. Sorry, Elisha, I don't know if you heard me, but this isn't enough for 100 men. Well, the Lord says that they're going to eat. Doesn't that sound kind of like a similar story with Jesus when he multiplied bread not for 100 people, but for 5,000 men, not including women and children? What do we learn from these stories of miraculous provisions? I think one thing that we need to see, really from this story and the one before that, is that God's wisdom is greater than human wisdom. Putting flour in poisonous stew doesn't work scientifically. Feeding 100 men with 20 loaves of bread and having some left over doesn't work according to science. But in verse 44, everything happened according to the word of the Lord. By the way, you realize that 1st and 2nd Kings were originally one book. And they had to split it in half because the scrolls could only carry so many feet of information. So they had to split it into 2 books. What's the theme that runs through 1st and 2nd Kings when you look at it as one book? Almost every chapter says something like, according to the word of the Lord, according to the word of the Lord, just as the prophet said. The book is showing us from so many different angles that everything God says is true. And so often in the case of the book of 1st and 2nd Kings, it's things that go against what the world says. I like what one person says. Worldliness is whatever any culture does to make sin seem normal and righteousness seem strange. That's what worldliness is. Can you think of anything that in our society we try to make sin look normal and maybe even like noble? And whatever God says to look like really strange, like how about what Dylan preached on last time, that greatness means serving other people. Well, how am I going to throw my weight around? And how are people going to realize my greatness if I'm fixated on serving other people? I don't know, but the Lord said to do that. You know, what can you go back in your mind to I remember when I was my first job working at a gun club, and there was a few people that worked at the gun club and came to the gun club talking about Bitcoin. Back when it was 19 cents or whatever it was. You know, if only we would have known good investments to make, you could be a Bitcoin billionaire right now. But you're not, because you weren't making wise investments. And now we got all these other cryptocurrencies that hey, just wait a couple months and it's going to shoot up and all that. The world says, invest in this, invest in ETFs, and invest in the stock market, invest in Bitcoin, whatever. And then the Bible says that the best investments you can make are storing up treasures in heaven. Yeah, well, that doesn't seem to make sense because sometimes that means I have to give things up, which is the next lesson. Elisha's willingness to share in a famine. Have you ever had a time before where you've had opportunities to give, and you gave, but it really didn't affect the way that you lived your life because it was a lot of excess that you gave? And then other times when you gave, and it came from a little bit more of a place of constraint, and you weren't sure how it was going to work out, but in one way or another it did, and Elisha's saying, I want to share this bread with all these guys, you end up being blessed in ways that you didn't anticipate, and that's not to teach some kind of health and wealth gospel, but Jesus takes care of people that are good stewards. Maybe here's a third thing from this. We have the antidote for the poison. When they were eating that stew where there was death in the pot, you could look at that as the world has got a big pot of all kinds of poisonous philosophies. And we've got something that if we would share it with those people, they wouldn't be feeding on death anymore. I like what Charles Spurgeon says, spread the gospel, spread the gospel, spread the gospel. Appeals to Parliament, will they be effectual? By the way, just stop there for a second. Appeals to Parliament. Vote for this person, vote for that person. It's really, really, really important what happens in the political realm. And Charles Spurgeon says, let those who choose to do so cry to lawyers and parliaments, but as for us, we will preach the gospel. If I could speak with a voice of thunder, I would say to those friends who are for adopting other means to stop the spread of error, you waste your time and strength, give all your efforts to the preaching of the gospel. That is what changes people. Do you look at our society and our world as a bunch of people trying to feed off of death? And if we would come and show and help get into the hearts of people the thing that actually reverses things and actually transforms people, who do you know that you could ask to read the Bible with you? Who do you know that you could ask to one of the Bible studies that happens during the week? Are we more concerned about politics or Jesus' kingdom? Look at the final story. The miraculous axe head. So we skip over the story of Naaman. And look what happens in 2 Kings chapter 6, verses 1 through 7. Now the sons of the prophets said to Elisha, "See, the place where we dwell under your charge is too small for us. Let us go to the Jordan, and each get us there a log, and let us make a place for us to dwell there." And he answered, "Go." Then one of them said, "Be pleased to go with your servants." And he answered, "I will go." So he went with them, and when they came to the Jordan, they cut down trees. And as one was felling a log, his axe head fell into the water, and he cried out, "Alas, my master, it was borrowed." Then the man of God said, "Where did it fall?" When he showed him the place, he cut off a stick and threw it in there and made the iron float. And he said, "Take it up." So he reached out his hand and took it. So in the previous story, we saw that the sons of the prophets, had at least 100 people. Maybe they're growing. More people are attracted to this countercultural movement. And somebody comes up to Elisha saying, "Hey, is it either a house that they're dwelling in or like a place that they meet in for like Bible studies? I don't know what it is." But he says that whatever we're doing, we're outgrowing where we are. And so we would like to all get our own logs and then contribute to making some kind of a cabin or something like that. And they say to Elisha, "Hey, will you come with us?" Elisha says, "Yep, I'll accompany you with all of this." They all go to the Jordan River and they're cutting down trees. Imagine the sound of, hitting trees down. And this guy has a accident. Yeah, that's good. The iron axe head flies off the axe handle, and it goes into the water. Thunk. Can you imagine this guy who has borrowed this axe? And it's made out of iron, and iron's not very common in this day. And if he can't retrieve this somehow, he might be in debt the rest of his life with how poor these people are. And here comes Elisha. Good thing he came with. And he goes, "Okay, where did it go?" And the guy says, maybe he's shaking his hand. It's over there. I don't know how this is going to work out. Okay, get a stick. Just hold on a second, guy. It's going to be okay. Throw it into the water, and then boom, this axe head comes up. Can you imagine when Elisha says, "Hey, pick it up"? He's like, he picks it up. How did this happen? Well, why do we have this story in the Bible? Maybe there's a couple lessons we could learn from this. Is God's concern for small things? I understand that in the life of this man, this is not a small thing. This is a crippling life event if the axe head is not going to be retrieved. But in the grand scheme of things, this is just one unimportant guy by a river. And would God really be concerned about this guy when there's so many other things going on? I mean, after all, this is during the reign of really wicked kings in the northern kingdom, and God would surely be more concerned about all these wicked kings and trying to stop the things they're doing. But you got this guy that's on the periphery of society, and God's taking care of this man. 1 Peter 5:7, casting all your anxieties on him because he cares for you. The Bible tells us to cast not just some of them, not just the ones that feel weightier to us than others, but to cast all of our anxieties on. It doesn't matter how small it might seem to you. It doesn't matter what you might think other people are going through in their life and how they have things that might be more difficult. We have a God that listens to all of us with all of our anxieties. The imagery of casting something, he doesn't just say, lay your anxieties upon. He uses the word casting. What is the mental imagery that you get from the word casting? If I have this water bottle here, you can just kind of chuck it. But let's say that I got something that, like a big boulder. This is even lighter, but this is a big boulder. And I have a hard time even holding it with two hands, but you cast heavy things. You have to use, that's the imagery of casting your anxieties on the Lord. Do you have heavy things on your heart that you've been going to one person after another, after another, after another, but you haven't heaved it upon the Lord's feet to do something with it? God's concerned with things that might seem small to you in the big picture of things. But here's another thing. God's also concerned with lost things. Have you ever thought about the connections or the similarities between this story and the story of Naaman that takes place right before this? In both of these stories, Naaman and the axe head were both lost. Naaman was spiritually lost. The axe head was literally lost. And Naaman and the axe head were retrieved by coming through water. In the same river, by the way, as well. And so it's like both of these stories have got those parallels going on with them. And I think we learn in the story of Naaman and the story of the axe head that God is concerned with things that are lost, and he's concerned with retrieving things that are lost. And he does it in a similar way today through water. 1 Peter 3:21, baptism, which corresponds to this, now saves you, not as a removal of dirt from the body, but as an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. You know how God has delivered people from difficulties in the Old Testament through water with Naaman? He delivered Noah through the floodwaters. Before a priest could enter into the holy places, he had to wash in water. And then in the New Testament, you've got this instruction that in baptism, this is the moment that God saves people. This is the moment that he retrieves that which is lost. And it's all made possible through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. I don't know if you're here this morning and you're still lost. But the way that God has chosen to save things that are lost is going to be through the water. If you haven't submitted to that, this is an opportunity to do that. And be thinking about that. But do any of these stories with Elisha and the sons of the prophets, do any of them remind you of Jesus? Multiplying food for people, concerned for things that were lost, standing up for the outcast and the neglected of society. Jesus was poor, yet he made many rich. And he lived in a society with wicked people. And he chose to give life to people. He chose to be a blessing to those around them. We live in a wicked time. Every age is wicked. And we all have the same choice. Am I going to align myself with the sons of the prophets and be the margins of society where true life is found? Or am I going to bow the knee to whatever the powers say you ought to believe and maybe have some of the earthly riches because of that? The true blessings are with the sons of the prophets. If there's anything that anybody needs this morning, this is an opportunity to allow Jesus to start leading your life. If there's anything that we can do, don't leave here without talking to somebody, or the opportunity is always there to come forward while we stand and while we sing.